Today, Maduro is declared the winner in a disputed Venezuelan election. Israel's cabinet authorises a response to a deadly rocket strike on the Golan Heights as fears grow of a wider regional conflict. Iraq pushes for withdrawal of US and coalition forces. And Italy changes track as it tries to tempt tourists away from crowded hotspots. It's Monday, July 29th. This is Reuters World News, bringing you everything you need to know from the front lines in 10 minutes every weekday. I'm Tara Oakes in Liverpool. Hytham, a resident of a Golan Heights village where a rocket attack killed 12 children and teenagers over the weekend. Standing near the deserted football pitch which was hit, he said they needed a ceasefire, adding that we want to live, we don't want to die. The deadly rocket strike has added to concerns that Israel and the Iran-backed Lebanese group Hezbollah could be sucked into a full-scale war, something they have both previously indicated they want to avoid, but for which they have also said they are ready. Hezbollah has denied any responsibility for the attack, the deadliest in Israel or Israeli-annexed territory since Hamas's October 7th assault sparked the war in Gaza. Edmund Blair is our Middle East editor.
This incident happened in Masht al-Shams, which is in the Golan Heights. This is an area which was captured by Israel in the 1967 war. It was captured from Syria. Afterwards, Israel annexed the territory. However, it's not been internationally or broadly recognized as part of Israel. So the Druze community in that part, in the Golan, are people who would originally have been living under the Syrians. And so their allegiance to Israel is not assured. They don't necessarily see themselves as Israelis. And in that respect, they would differ from the Druze community in the rest of Israel, where they are full Israeli citizens and would serve in the army and have all the responsibilities and loyalties that you would associate with Israeli citizens.
Israeli jets already hit southern Lebanon on Sunday. What could any stronger response look like?
The comments we've had, both in the Israeli press and indeed from Israeli officials, suggest that they are looking for a significant response and yet to some extent calibrated. What does that mean in practice? Well, perhaps the comparisons are somewhere between either what we've seen on the ground over the period of this conflict, where we've seen tit-for-tat raids that have been generally confined to southern Lebanon region, and 2006, the last time Hezbollah and Israel fought an all-out war. In 2006, we saw huge strikes across Lebanon by Israel that hit all sorts of infrastructure. The fact that we have not seen an immediate response on that kind of scale may be cause for some optimism that it will be a calibrated response by Israel and this escalation will be contained. However, this is the Middle East. Making predictions is always a dangerous job.
Soy Nicolas Maduro, Presidente.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro declaring himself the winner of the country's election in a passionate speech in Caracas. But his opposition rival, Edmundo Gonzalez, has also claimed victory. The country's electoral authorities said Maduro had won a third term with 51% of the vote, despite multiple exit polls pointing to an opposition win. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken questioned Maduro's claim.
We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people.
Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has vowed to relaunch cooperation with China as she signed a 3-year action plan during her first official visit to Beijing since taking office. Meloni said her 5-day trip was a demonstration of the will to begin a new phase in the two countries' relations. At the Olympics in Paris, the swimming training session for the triathlon has been cancelled for the second day in a row because of water quality concerns in the Seine. France has spent more than $1 billion to cut sewage flowing into the river, but weekend heavy rain has caused quality issues, with the men's triathlon due to take place tomorrow. Japan's top economic council has said the government and central bank must guide policy by taking into careful consideration recent yen weakness that is hurting consumption. The weak yen is also likely to be a key topic of debate at the Bank of Japan's two-day policy meeting, which ends on Wednesday, when its board will lay out a detailed plan to taper its huge bond buying and debate whether to raise interest rates. Iraq is pushing for troops from the US-led military coalition to begin withdrawing in the next few months. That's according to several Iraqi sources. The formal end to the coalition's work could then be completed by September next year. Timur Razari is in Baghdad and explains why this is such a difficult balancing act for Iraq.
Iraq has witnessed these tit-for-tat strikes between Iran-backed militias and US forces since October 7th. It's part of this regional escalation. And so what we've seen in the past 7 months is a process of talks between Washington and Baghdad to reassess this international coalition that came to Iraq a decade ago. Iraq has wanted these troops to leave sooner rather than later, given the fact that the Prime Minister told us he sees them as a magnet for instability. But at the same time, they want to transition to a bilateral relationship with the Americans. The Iraqis are very keen to show that they're not kicking out the Americans. They are transitioning. They want the US to advise them, to assist their military forces, because remember, the Iraqi military collapsed a decade ago when ISIS stormed across the border from Syria.
What's changed in the last few months?
The Iraqi government that came to power about 1.5 years ago has always said it wants to reassess the coalition, but they weren't really serious about it until October 7th. Iraq is a rare ally of both Washington and Tehran, and so every Iraqi prime minister has to balance those relations. The current prime minister, Mohammad Shia Sudani, has had to do that at a particularly difficult time with all of this violence in the region and all of this, rising tension. What we've seen is he's actually threaded that needle. He has on the one side Iran-backed groups who basically are telling him, get the US out now. And on the other side, he has the Americans who actually would have been pretty happy to stay for a few more years. And so what we see is we're going to get something in the middle. You're going to see some amount of US troops leave sooner rather than later, but you're also going to see some stay on. And so the sources we speak to generally, they say the prime minister has done this job. He is walking this tightrope between both sides.
And if your summer vacation is still in the planning stage, in Italy, a move is underway to try and get some of the country's millions of tourists to consider alternatives to the ancient ruins of Rome, the canals of Venice, or the sparkling waters of Lake Como. To ease pressure on these hotspots, alternative attractions are being encouraged in less well-known parts of Italy. Giulia Segretti has visited one such attraction, a vintage railway in the heart of the country.
I traveled on what is known as the Italian Trans-Siberian Line, or also the Park Railway. It's a line that goes through the central Italian regions of Abruzzo and Molise. It's a spectacular trip. The train crossed the Maiella National Park, its forests, the so-called highlands of Abruzzo. It climbs over 1,000 meters in altitude to what is known as the second highest point of the country's rail network. You are basically surrounded by nature all the time, but you also feel as though you're in another era because the pace is so slow and it allows you to take everything in. It's a vintage train with a diesel locomotive towing carriages from the 1930s and the 1950s. One of the other aspects of this project is that it's bringing tourists to these smaller towns, and it means that you are helping these smaller, forgotten economies.
That's almost it for today's edition of Reuters World News. But before we go, our recommended read today is on the Trump effect in Europe's clean tech sector. European companies focused on clean energy are abandoning expansion plans because of fears over what a potential election victory for Donald Trump could mean. There's a link to that story in the pod description. And for more on any of the stories from today, check out Reuters.com or the Reuters app. We'll be back tomorrow with our daily headline show. And to never miss an episode, subscribe on your favourite podcast player.